The sky above Europe was a graveyard of smoke and fire. It was 1944, and the war had reached its boiling point. Allied bombers streaked across German skies in massive formations, their engines roaring like thunder over cities already scarred by years of devastation. On the other side, the Luftwaffe, once fierce and unmatched, was running out of fuel, pilots, and time. Every mission carried a sense of finality, every sortie a roll of the dice. For the young men who climbed into those fragile cockpits, each takeoff could be their last. High above the clouds, one such man, a Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Keller, adjusted his oxygen mask and stared out over the endless gray. He was 22 years old, but looked far older, aged by exhaustion and loss. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 rattled as it climbed, chasing a formation of American bombers somewhere over the Rhineland. Below him, the land was scarred, villages burned, railways shattered, forests turned to craters. It was a world slowly being erased. Keller's orders were simple: intercept the bombers before they reached another German industrial site. But his heart wasn't in it. He had seen too many of his comrades vanish into smoke trails, their parachutes never opening. The radio crackled with coded chatter, his squadron leader barking orders, frantic voices calling out for help, then silence. The Luftwaffe was stretched to its breaking point. Fuel reserves were running dry. Replacement pilots arrived half-trained. What once was the pride of Germany's air power was now a desperate remnant, held together by courage and habit. As Keller banked his plane, the sun caught the silver wings of the enemy far ahead. An armada of American B-17s, escorted by sleek, deadly P-51 Mustangs. The P-51s were fast, precise, and relentless. They owned the skies now, for Luftwaffe pilots. Just seeing them meant trouble. Keller had faced them before, and each time he'd come back with fewer friends. But duty demanded he press on. He flicked a switch, checked his gauges, and froze. The fuel indicator was dipping faster than it should. His eyes narrowed. Somewhere in the chaos of recent missions, the maintenance crew must have missed something, or maybe his reserve tank was leaking. Either way, he knew what it meant. He couldn't make it back. Not with this much fuel. Not this far from home. Still, he stayed on course, climbing higher. Below him, anti-aircraft shells blossomed like dark flowers. The sky erupted with gunfire. One bomber spiraled out of formation, its right wing aflame. Keller felt the old instinct tug at him, the hunter's urge. His thumb hovered over the trigger. But something stopped him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the sheer pointlessness of it all. The war was already lost, even if no one dared admit it. He broke away from the formation, watching the chaos recede into the distance. His fuel needle trembled near empty. There was no choice now. He would have to glide as far as possible, maybe find field, maybe survive. He turned his plane westward, toward the open countryside below, the kind of green fields that looked peaceful from above, even in wartime. But Keller wasn't over Germany anymore. The wind and combat drift had pushed him far beyond friendly lines. He was now deep over Allied-controlled territory. As his engine sputtered, he tapped the gauge again, willing it to move. Nothing. The propeller began to slow. Silence filled the cockpit, a silence more terrifying than any gunfire. Without engine noise, the wind seemed deafening. Keller's gloved hands tightened around the stick. He knew what happened to captured German pilots. Some were lucky, others were not. And here he was, gliding helplessly into the hands of the enemy. Below, the patchwork of fields grew clearer. A farmhouse, a road, a river cutting through like a silver thread. He could almost smell the earth. If he could just land without crashing, if he could just make it down alive, maybe there was a chance. But then he saw something else. A glint of metal, coming from the east, fast and low, a fighter plane, closing in. His heart sank, sleek and unmistakable, painted with white stripes and a shining star on its wing. A P-51 Mustang. Keller swallowed hard. He was a sitting duck. The American pilot would see him gliding, engine dead, no power to fight or flee. All it would take was one burst of machine gun fire, one squeeze of the trigger, and it would be over. He looked up, watching the Mustang approach through the canopy. The plane moved with a grace that only pure control could create. It slid into formation beside him, matching his speed perfectly. Keller could see the pilot now. A young man, maybe his own age, wearing a leather jacket and a calm expression behind his goggles. The two men stared at each other across the void. For a moment, time stopped. The war below seemed to fade. The smoke, the destruction, the death, all of it disappeared in that single, silent encounter. Two enemies, both exhausted, both human, both trapped in a sky that had claimed too many lives already. Keller waited for the gunfire. He braced himself for the flash of tracers. But the Mustang didn't fire. Instead, it did something no one could have predicted. The American pilot waggled his wings. A simple gesture, a signal often used between friends in the air. Then, slowly, he tilted his plane, flying alongside the helpless German as if to guide him. Keller blinked in disbelief. Was it a trick? Was the American toying with him before finishing the job? But the Mustang held position, unwavering, protective even. Below them, Allied soldiers on the ground pointed upward. To them, it must have looked impossible, a German fighter gliding dead through their skies, and an American escorting it like a guardian. Keller's mind raced. Why wasn't he shooting? Why was he helping? What did this mean? As the ground loomed closer and the last of his altitude vanished, one truth began to take shape, a truth that would redefine what it meant to be an enemy in war. And this was only the beginning. The wind screamed around the canopy as Keller's Messerschmitt began to descend, its propeller now frozen. Below him, the earth rushed closer. Fields, hedgerows, and a narrow dirt road that cut across the landscape like a lifeline. The P-51 stayed beside him, unwavering, its silver wings gleaming in the morning light. Keller's mind spun in disbelief. Was this American pilot truly escorting him? Helping him? He glanced over again. The Mustang's pilot lifted one hand from the throttle and gestured downward, pointing toward an open field ahead. Keller understood instantly. The American wasn't going to shoot. He was guiding him to a safe landing. The Messerschmitt trembled as Keller lowered the landing gear. The hydraulic system groaned, barely responding. He pulled back gently on the stick, feeling the weight of the aircraft as it glided through the air. His every nerve was alive. If he misjudged even by a few feet, he'd crash, and that would be the end. The ground came up fast. Keller's wheels struck the earth with a bone-rattling jolt, bouncing once, then settling hard into mud. Dirt and grass flew past the canopy. The plane skidded, tilted, and finally came to rest. Silence. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and Keller's own heartbeat hammering in his ears. He looked up, and there it was, the P-51 circling above him like a watchful hawk. Then, with a final waggle of its wings, the American banked away and disappeared into clouds. For several long seconds, Keller just sat there, frozen. The war, the noise, the madness, it all seemed distant now. He had just been spared by his enemy. Not by chance, not by confusion, but by choice. He opened the canopy and climbed out, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The distant thunder of artillery echoed faintly from the front lines. Keller looked up one last time, half expecting to see the Mustang return. But the sky was empty again. In the distance, he could already hear the rumble of trucks, Allied patrols moving through the countryside. He knew he'd be captured soon. But strangely, he didn't feel fear. Something had shifted inside him, something more powerful than orders, ideology, or propaganda. That moment between two pilots, a silent exchange of mercy, was one of those rare human miracles that somehow survived the fire of war. Years later, stories like this would surface again and again from both sides of the conflict. Tales of compassion amid chaos. British pilots helping wounded Germans back to base. American bombers spared by Luftwaffe aces who refused to shoot down a crippled aircraft. Most of these stories were whispered, half forgotten, buried beneath the overwhelming narrative of violence. But they existed, and they mattered. To understand just how remarkable this encounter was, you have to understand what fly in those skies really meant. By 1944, the air war over Europe had become one of the most brutal arenas of the entire conflict. Dogfights were fought at hundreds of miles per hour. with split-second decisions meaning the difference between life and death. Pilots faced temperatures below freezing at high altitude, with oxygen masks that sometimes froze solid. Even the best-trained men could lose consciousness in seconds if hit or spun out. The Luftwaffe pilots, once feared across Europe, were now desperately outnumbered. Many of them had less than a month of flight experience before being thrown into combat. They were up against thousands of Allied bombers protected by the new long-range escorts, the P-51 Mustangs. The Mustangs were faster, deadlier, and could follow the bombers deep into German territory. For the Luftwaffe, it was like trying to fight a tidal wave with a handful of pebbles. Franz Keller's situation, running out of fuel over enemy territory, was tragically common. Germany's synthetic fuel plants had been heavily bombed, and by late 1944, pilots often had to ration every drop. Missions were planned with almost no margin for error. Many pilots never made it home, not because they were shot down, but because they simply ran out of gas. And yet, on that day, instead of facing a fiery end, Keller found himself saved by one of those very Mustangs he was taught to hate. Historians and aviation experts have long debated stories like this. Could such encounters truly have happened? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. One of the most famous real-life parallels is the story of Franz Stigler, a German ace who intercepted a damaged American B-17 in December 1943. The bomber was limping home, its crew wounded, its tail barely holding together. Stigler could have finished him off easily. Instead, he escorted the B-17 out of German airspace, saluted the American pilot, and turned away. Decades later, the two men, Stigler and Charlie Brown, met again and became close friends. Keller's story echoes that same spirit. Different skies, different moment, but the same flicker of humanity that defied the madness of war. For many pilots, there was a code, an unspoken rule of honor. They called it the brotherhood of the air, no matter the flag on their fuselage. They shared the same sky, the same fear, and the same understanding that death could come at any moment. To show mercy to a helpless opponent wasn't weakness. It was strength of character. As the Allies advanced across Europe, the air war began to shift. Many Luftwaffe pilots, knowing the end was near, chose not to fight to the death. Some surrendered, others defected, and a few, like Keller, were caught in that strange twilight between duty and morality. Keller would later be captured by Allied troops near the French border. His aircraft, riddled with bullet holes and out of fuel, was examined by mechanics who marveled at how far it had glided. He was taken to a prisoner of war camp, where he spent the rest of the conflict reflecting on the war, on the faces of those he'd fought, and on one American pilot who had every reason to kill him but chose not to. The story would have likely faded into obscurity, one among millions of forgotten wartime memories. But decades later, in a small aviation museum in England, a group of historians found records of a downed German Bf-109 with no damage, discovered intact behind Allied lines. Witnesses in the area had reported seeing an American plane flying alongside it before it landed. It wasn't proof, but it was enough. Enough to suggest that Keller's strange act of mercy and the Americans' impossible decision wasn't just a rumor. It was something real, something that had happened, if only for a few fleeting minutes, in a sky filled with hatred. That single act would come to represent something far greater than either man could have imagined. Years passed. The war ended in fire and silence. Cities were rebuilt, borders redrawn, and soldiers went home, those who were lucky enough to have a home left. For Franz Keller, the war had ended not in death, but in capture, and then in years of rebuilding a life that no longer felt familiar. He was released from the prisoner of war camp in 1946 and returned to a Germany in ruins. Everything he had known, the airfields, his comrades, even the Luftwaffe itself, was gone, erased from history like chalk from a board. For a long time, Keller didn't speak of that day over Allied territory. He couldn't. The memories were too heavy, and no one wanted to hear about compassion between enemies. People wanted heroes and villains, not stories that blurred the line between the two. So he kept it locked inside, a private moment of grace in a world that had gone mad. But as the years rolled on, something about that day refused to fade. The image of the silver P-51 fly alongside him, The American pilot's calm face, the silent wave of the wings, stayed with him. Sometimes, late at night, he'd wake from dreams of that endless sky, his heart pounding, as if he were back in the cockpit, gliding through the silence. And always, in that dream, the Mustang was there. Decades later, in the 1980s, Keller attended a small aviation reunion in England. It was a gathering of former pilots, Allied and Axis alike, who had long since traded their uniforms for suits and gray hair. There was laughter, awkward handshakes, and quiet moments where enemies from another lifetime realized how similar they really were. As Keller walked through displays of restored aircraft, his eyes caught something, a polished P-51 Mustang, painted in the colors of the 8th Air Force. On its fuselage, near the cockpit, was a name stenciled in black paint, Sweet Lorraine. His breath caught. That was the plane. He was sure of it. The same shining silver, the same pattern on the nose, even the same faint scuff marks near the canopy. Keller felt a strange pull in his chest, a flood of memories rushing back all at once. He stepped closer, his reflection shimmering on the polished metal. Then he heard a voice behind him. "Beautiful bird, isn't she?" Keller turned. An older man stood there, tall, gray-haired, wearing a jacket with a pilot's patch on the sleeve. His accent was American. The man extended his hand. "Name's Jack Reynolds. I flew that Mustang back in the war." Keller froze. It couldn't be. After all these years, after decades of wondering, was this the same man? He hesitated, then shook the pilot's hand. "Franz Keller," he said quietly. "Luftwaffe." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, studying the German's face. Then his expression softened. "Wait a second. You flew a Bf-109, didn't you? Over France? You ran out of fuel." Keller's heart skipped. "Yes, you were there." The American smiled faintly, nodding. "Yeah, I saw you gliding. I thought about finishing the job, but something told me not to. Guess I figured one more dead pilot wouldn't change a damn thing." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The noise of the museum faded into the background, the chatter of visitors, the distant hum of engines, until all that remained was that memory, hanging between them like smoke. Keller swallowed hard. "I never got to thank you," he said. "You saved my life." Reynolds smiled gently. "Maybe you saved mine, too." After that day, I started thinking different about the war, about who we were really fighting. They stood there, two old men who had once been enemies, united by an act of mercy that defied everything the world had told them to be. In that moment, the war truly ended for both of them. Stories like theirs remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, humanity can survive. Amid orders and politics, hatred and fear, sometimes one person simply chooses to be human, and that choice, small, quiet, unseen, can ripple across time. Historians now look back at the air war with a mixture of awe and sadness. The bravery of the pilots is undeniable, but so is the tragedy of their youth, their wasted potential. Many of those who fought never saw the peace they helped create. But stories like that of Keller and Reynolds remind us that heroism isn't always about victory. It's about compassion in the face of chaos. In interviews years later, Reynolds spoke of that day in the skies with a quiet humility. He said, "I didn't think of him as a German. I just saw a man trying to live. We've been taught to kill, but sometimes you look at another pilot and realize he's just like you." Keller, too, would later reflect on that encounter. "He showed me mercy," he said, "and mercy in war is the rarest thing of all. It's easy to look back at history and see only the violence, the endless battles, the destruction, the politics. But between those moments, hidden like sparks in the dark, are stories of humanity that remind us who we are, stories that prove even in war, kindness can take flight. When the world looks back on that era, it often remembers the planes, the dogfights, the aces with their tallies painted on the sides of their fuselages. But few remember the moments of restraint, the choices not to pull the trigger. Those are the stories that define the soul of the man. As Keller and Reynolds stood together that day, posing for a photograph in front of the old Mustang, they didn't see enemies. They saw survivors. Two men who had stared into the abyss and, for one brief moment, had chosen something greater than victory. The camera clicked. The flash captured two smiles, tired, knowing, and at peace. Later, that photograph would hang in a small aviation museum, beneath a simple inscription. In war, mercy is the highest form of courage. When people look at it now, they see two old pilots in front of a warplane. But if they look closer, if they really look, they'll see what the war could never destroy. The moment when an American P-51 did the unthinkable, and in doing so, reminded the world what it meant to be human.